What is up, guys? Welcome back to another GeekaWhat video. In this video, I'm going to be building an awesome RTX based gaming PC build for 2022. I'll be running you through all the components I selected and why, and then checking out some of the latest RTX titles on the 3060 GPU, courtesy of today's video sponsors, Nvidia and Ebuyer. Without any further ado though, let's dive into it and kick things off by taking a look at the components and start, for a change, with the graphics card. We all know how difficult it's been this year to get hands-on with one of the latest, flashiest GPUs, and that's because cards like the RTX 3060 are just so strong. One of the big selling points, of course, of the 3000 series is its updated ray tracing support with those second generation RT cores, and of course support for Nvidia's DLSS technology. Ray tracing, for those of you who don't know, is basically a piece of tech that reimagines the way that light is dealt with in games, and rather than predicting where shadows and reflections should be, visible here for example in these puddles or through rays of sunlight, it actually goes ahead and traces the path of light from the source to make things super accurate. It's perfect for gaming at 1080p with RTX on and RTX off, and while this Aorus card from GeekaWhat is a little bit overkill in terms of being very high end, it's still going to work really well for the system today. And truth be told, any 3060 you can find is going to be a great shout. Fundamentally, the core GPU chip is exactly the same, as is your memory and the speed of your memory, so the 3060 architecture, shall we say, is what I've opted for. 3 fans on this unit though do a great deal to help, and with some of the latest RTX titles like the new Farming Simulator out and ready to play, it's a really appealing proposition. We'll be looking in more detail though at the ray tracing gameplay later in the benchmark section, so hold tight for that one. I'll be pairing up the 3060 with a Ryzen processor and of course a B550 AMD motherboard. I'll be honest, when picking the CPU and speccing this build up, I had a bit of a moment. The new Intel chips are a great option, and I really wanted to use the new 12600K, but stock and availability, especially of the DDR5 memory and the Z690 motherboards you need to couple them with, are still a bit sparse, meaning for a build where I did want to get maximum price to performance, I've tried to make it so there's as much money left for the GPU as possible, and as such the new 12th gen didn't really fit with that idea. As always, latest pricing and availability can be found at the links in the description below, international links and then UK links for ebuyer.com as well. Now once we've installed the CPU, we can go ahead and do the RAM. We'll jump back to the M.2 SSD in a moment. I've got a 16GB 3600MHz kit here of the XPG Spectrix D45 with this really nice metal black heat spreader, an RGB strip up top, and a simple aesthetic. It's going to work really nicely. We'll be installing it into the 2nd and 4th RAM DIMM slots, giving us dual channel memory for our Ryzen processor, something which, if you didn't know, is uber important. We're going to go ahead and just slide the RAM into place, bit of pressure on each side, lovely stuff, 16 gigs of juicy memory. You don't want to go for any less than that, as it will bottleneck the 3060. Honestly, this 60 tier of GPU is more like a 70 or even 80 from the last generation, so keep that in mind when picking your other components. Speaking of which, the storage. I've picked up a 1TB NVMe drive from Seagate. You don't want to go for a SATA drive for a build like this, you are going to create bottlenecks. If your SSD isn't quick enough to read and write game files in an effective manner, once again, the GPU will be forced to slow down a little bit, something we definitely don't want to happen in this system. It is worth noting though that this GeekaWhat Aorus motherboard also supports Gen 4 drives, so if you wanted a super quick drive with speeds in the region of like 7 GB a second, wow, then this board also future-proofs you for that very nicely indeed, which is always good to see. This value mindset is something which is carried over into the CPU cooler as well. I've opted to stick with the AMD stock cooler that comes included with the Ryzen processor. Now, some people may think this decision is a bit odd, especially when budget options from the likes of GeekaWhat exist. The reason is because once again it just saves you another $20 or so or 30 or so pounds. That is crucial in the current market, allowing you to spend that extra dough on, of course, a GPU, an SSD, or some of the other components which this year at least have witnessed some shortages. It's also super easy to install, and with plenty of airflow in the case for this system, we shouldn't have any issues keeping the processor cool. Maybe don't overclock it to 4 or 5 gigahertz, but out the box, the normal speeds, it's going to be absolutely fine. Once the motherboard is as far along as it can possibly be, in our case I think we're just about done, it's time to go ahead and grab your case. We'll be installing the motherboard assembly into the case first, followed by our GPU and then our power supply to wrap things up. When it comes to choosing a chassis, it can be quite a difficult conundrum. Thankfully, we've made a recent video where we've talked about the top 5 or 10 cases for different budgets. And that led me to this, the Cooler Master TD500 Mesh. With a full mesh panel at the front, a cool polygon design, and lots of tempered glass, it does the trick nicely. And at under $100 or £100, though of course these prices are sort of liable to change day by day, it's a really great value choice too. Perfect for future upgrades as well, with plenty of clearance for radiators, large GPUs, SSDs, and hard drives. One of the best products Cooler Master have ever made. I often find that it's easier to remove as many of the case's side panels, glass or steel, as possible before laying the case down flat to install the motherboard. We're going to line up the rear I/O shield built into this GeekaWhat Aorus board and then slide the motherboard into the case. Being a full-size ATX board in a full-size ATX case, all of your motherboard standoffs, that's the little posts to stop it grounding out, should be in the correct places. Nice and simple, 3 screws at the top, 3 along the middle and 3 along the bottom, and we're now on component 5 or 6 today. Awesome. And with that, we can go ahead and install the GPU. In one of those, here's one I prepared earlier moments, I've gone ahead and taken off the 2 PCI lane covers aligned with the top PCI slot. I'm going to push back the clip on the metal slot as well, and then line the GPU up. It's going to go in horizontally, a little something like this, and then once it's lined up, you can apply some pressure, and it will click nicely into place. Take some of these hexagonal screws that come included with your case and with your power supply, and we're going to be using these to actually fasten the card in and make sure it doesn't go anywhere. That's not it though, there is actually one more component left to install, and that's the power supply, in order to make sure the GPU, motherboard and CPU have got enough juice to get going. And that's where this comes in, the Cooler Master MWE 650 Gold V2. This power supply has got a few great features going for it, whether it be a 650 watt output, perfect for the 3060, or a fully modular interface, something which allows you to only plug in the cables you actually need to use. For this build, there's a few specific cables we're going to be using. First is a dual 6+2 pin PCI power harness, that's going to power up the GPU. Second is the largest connector, that's our 24 pin motherboard power cable, which of course goes from the power supply to the motherboard, specifically the right hand side up here. Finally, we'll also be bopping in one of these CPU power connectors. It's 8 pins, or 4+4 to be precise, with one end going to the power supply and the other to the top left of the motherboard. Whack these into your power supply, screw the PSU in, and make sure your motherboard's wired up, and with that, everything pretty much is powered and ready to go. All that's really left to do then is plug in some of the front panel connections, something we've covered off in detail in a few of our build guides already. Before we go ahead and actually check out the performance, testing out some of those new ray tracing titles, I think first we need to boot the machine up and see just how good it looks, with all those RGB fans, the Aorus 3060, and of course the measly stock cooler. Just kidding, I'll see you in a second, but first, enjoy the visuals and roll that montage. Nicely done. The system looks absolutely awesome, but does the performance stack up to the visuals? Well, I'm glad to announce that we've benchmarked a wide range of titles, including some of the latest games to support ray tracing and DLSS. We're going to look at the RTX titles first, and then jump back to some of the more generic games a bit later. First up is Guardians of the Galaxy. I thought that to begin with, we'd run this at 1080p, high settings, with no ray tracing enabled, to see what the before and after was, so to speak. Here we managed to achieve 143 frames per second on average, with 132 and 120 for the 90 and 99th percentile results. Despite the lack of ray tracing, the game looked great, but I wondered what would happen if we stuck at the 1080p resolution, enabled ray tracing, and tested our frame rates all over again. Well, here the frame rate did drop as you'd expect, but only by 11 frames per second. That's right, 1080p ray tracing and DLSS enabled, we still managed to achieve 132 FPS on average. We all know ray tracing looks great at 1080p, but what about 1440p? Can we push that resolution even higher? I'm glad to report that we can. Here at 1440p with ray tracing enabled, we got 105 frames per second on average, with strong 90 and 99th percentile results that didn't show a great deal of frame rate deviation. It was a similarly positive story in Farming Simulator 2022. Oh yes, we're getting serious now, boys. 1080p high settings with no DLSS saw 166 frames per second, with 146 and 124 for the 90 and 99th percentiles, with the frame rate increasing to 184 with DLSS enabled. In all seriousness though, this game does have a pretty strong following, and I'm sure there's a few of you guys watching who enjoy playing it, and now it's even better with DLSS. Bright Memory Infinite is next up, and this is another game we were relatively impressed. First off, at 1080p high settings, we got 150 frames per second. This is with no ray tracing enabled. Turning RTX on, and we jump down to 123 frames per second. Once again, less than a 20% performance hit with ray tracing enabled. Kind of crazy, right? But once again, what about 1440p? Well, in Bright Memory Infinite at 1440p with ray tracing enabled, we once again saw some fantastic results. 105 frames per second on average. That's well in excess of the 60 or 70 FPS you'd be looking to get for viable first-person shooter gaming performance. All, of course, with NVIDIA ray tracing and DLSS enabled. We also, of course, tested out some of the traditional titles. Cyberpunk 2077, for example. We managed to achieve more than 60 FPS at 1080p with ray tracing enabled. Something which is actually not a bad result, considering how difficult Cyberpunk can be to run irrespective of any RTX settings. But what about games like Fortnite, those first-person shooters? Well, here at 1080p competitive settings, we managed to achieve just over 300 frames per second. This is with everything tuned down to low, but the render distance set to far, showing just how powerful the 3060 is when it comes to 1080p gaming. It was the same, surprisingly, in Farming Simulator 2022. With 1440p tested this time around, DLSS of course still enabled, we got 125 frames per second, with strong 90 and 99th percentile results that show the power of the mighty 3060. With that though, that pretty much wraps it up for not only the performance but also the gaming benchmarks portion of this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to get subscribed. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.